Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of Wrestle War 1992. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It is the Taylor Made Man and Greg the Hammer Valentine versus the Freebirds for the WCW United States Tag Team Championships. Number one, I thought this was a good opening matchup to start Wrestle War 92. Back and forth matchup between both teams with the Freebirds keeping the pace of the match. Jimmy Garvin ultimately hits a devastating DDT on Taylor, pins him for the 3, and your winners of the match, and at that time new WCW United States Tag Team Champions, are the Freebirds. Hats off to the Freebirds for getting the win in that match and becoming, at that time, the new WCW United States Tag Team Champions. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Johnny B. Bad versus Tracy Smothers. I thought this was also a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Johnny B. Bad and Tracy Smothers, with Johnny keeping the pace of the match. Johnny ultimately hits a devastating power slam on Tracy Smothers in the middle of the ring. And then Johnny B. Bad ultimately hits his signature devastating left hook on Tracy Smothers, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Johnny B. Bad. Hats off to Johnny B. Bad for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Marcus Bagwell versus Scotty Flamingo. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Bagwell and Flamingo, with Scotty keeping the pace of the match. Bagwell and Flamingo end up both exchanging in the middle of the ring, but Scotty Flamingo ends up hitting a roll-up on Marcus Bagwell, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Scotty Flamingo. Hats off to Scotty Flamingo for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Mr. Hughes and Cactus Jack versus JYD and Ron Simmons. I thought this was a really good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Cactus Jack ends up attacking Junkyard Dog before they make their way down to the ring. Cactus Jack ends up hitting an elbow drop off the ramp onto JYD. JYD looks hurt. He ends up getting taken back to the backstage area with the medical staff. Mr. Hughes ends up hitting a devastating knee drop. Ron Simmons then was keeping the pace of the match, though. Ron ends up hitting a spine buster in the middle of the ring, and then Ron Simmons ultimately hits a 3-point stance, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Ron Simmons and JYD. Hats off to Ron Simmons and JYD for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Todd Champion versus Super Invader. I thought this was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between Todd Champion and Super Invader, with Super Invader keeping the pace of the match. But ultimately, Super Invader hits a devastating powerbomb on Todd Champion, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Super Invader. Hats off to the Super Invader for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Richard Morton versus Big Josh. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Richard Morton and Big Josh, with Big Josh keeping the pace of the match. And Big Josh ends up hitting the finish on Richard Morton, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Big Josh. Hats off to Big Josh for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Z-Man versus Brian Pillman for Pillman's WCW Light Heavyweight Championship. I thought this was a decent match. Back and forth matchup between the Z-Man and Pillman, with Pillman hitting a devastating head scissors on the Z-Man. Z-Man then gets up, hits a step-up enziguri on Pillman. Pillman then applies a figure 4 leg lock on the Z-Man, but Z-Man breaks the hold. Pillman then goes for a springboard maneuver, but the Z-Man counters it with a devastating power slam. But Pillman ultimately hits a roll-up on the Z-Man, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Brian Pillman. Hats off to Brian Pillman for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a tag team matchup. It is Takayuki Iizuka and Tatsumi Fujinami versus the Steiner Brothers. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Iizuka hitting a senton off the top rope. Scott Steiner then hits a underhook powerbomb, and then Rick ultimately hits an overhead belly-to-belly suplex off the middle rope, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are the Steiner Brothers. Hats off to the Steiner Brothers for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Wrestle War 1992. It is the War Games matchup. It is the Dangerous Alliance versus Nikita Koloff, Sting, Dustin Rhodes, Barry Windham, and Ricky Steamboat. I thought this was a great matchup. Windham and Austin were starting the matchup for both of their teams. Dangerous Alliance was keeping the pace of the match. Zbyszko ends up hitting Eaton with the turnbuckle. Sting ends up applying an arm lock on Eaton's arm that was already injured. Eaton ends up tapping out. And your winners of the match are Sting, Dustin Rhodes, Barry Windham, Nikita Koloff, and Ricky Steamboat. A couple of things I want to say about Wrestle War 1992, man, before I get out of here. It was a decent event. I'm not going to sit here and say this was one of the best events WCW ever put together as far as the pay-per-view is concerned. A couple of matches on here that I did like. Number one was Marcus Bagwell versus Scotty Flamingo. Scotty Flamingo, if you guys don't know who he is, he also went by the name of Raven. He's more predominantly known by Raven from his time in ECW and his later days that he got in WCW. But that match between Bagwell and Flamingo was a decent match. Todd Champion versus Super Invader. It was an okay match, a little bit lackluster. Mr. Hughes and Cactus Jack teaming up against JYD and Ron Simmons. That was a really good matchup. I was kind of hoping that JYD wouldn't get injured in that match due to the elbow drop that Cactus Jack hit off the ramp. But it was a brutal spot in that match. And it turned into a tag team match to a handicap match with Ron Simmons pretty much being out there by himself. But it was a decent match at best. The other match on here that I also did appreciate besides the War Games matchup was Z-Man and Brian Pillman. The match for the WCW Light Heavyweight Championship. Brian Pillman, in my honest opinion, man, was severely underrated throughout his entire career. I think Pillman really didn't get his fair shake in professional wrestling, in my honest opinion. He could have been multi-time cruiserweight champion, even world champion. I think Brian Pillman was severely underrated for the skill set that he had. I think the skill set that Brian Pillman presented in the early days of WCW, I don't think a lot of people, could really fathom what this guy was doing inside that square circle, man. So it was a decent matchup for the WCW Light Heavyweight Championship at that time. And obviously the main event, the War Games match, legendary matchup. Two teams in a double cage practically. Fantastic matchup, man. And Sting, Dustin Rhodes, Barry Windham, Nikita Koloff, and Ricky Steamboat ended up securing the win in that matchup by submission. If I had to give War Games 1992 a solid rating from 1 out of 10, I'm probably going to have to give it a solid 4, maybe 4.5 at best. Like I said, man, this was not the best WCW pay-per-view I've ever seen. It damn sure was not the worst. But, again, there was a couple decent matches on here, but I felt like besides the War Games match and maybe the Pillman vs. Z-Man Light Heavyweight Championship match, other than that, man, it was kind of lackluster in my honest opinion. So I'm going to have to give Wrestle War 1992 a solid rating of a 4, 4.5 at best. But this is my review of Wrestle War 1992. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.